The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the military mess hall as Lieutenant Sarah Chen walked through the entrance, her civilian clothes giving no hint of her true identity. She had deliberately chosen to wear jeans and a simple navy blue sweater for this undercover assignment at the Naval Training Facility. Her commanding officer had sent her here to observe recruit behavior and assess training protocols, but she was supposed to blend in as just another visitor. The mess hall was typical of military facilities she had seen around the world during her 8 years as a Navy SEAL. Gray walls, metal tables arranged in neat rows, and the constant hum of conversation mixed with the clatter of trays and utensils. The smell of institutional food hung in the air, bringing back memories of her own recruit days when she was just another young woman trying to prove herself in a male-dominated environment. Sarah grabbed a tray and moved through the food line, keeping her movements casual and unremarkable. Her trained eyes automatically scanned the room, noting exits, potential threats, and the general atmosphere. Most of the recruits appeared focused on their meals and conversations with their fellow trainees. The energy was what she expected from young men and women in their first months of military service. A mixture of exhaustion, determination, and nervous energy. As she reached for a sandwich, Sarah noticed a table of 5 male recruits in the far corner of the mess hall. Their body language immediately caught her attention. While most recruits sat with proper military posture even during mealtimes, these 5 were slouched back in their chairs, speaking louder than necessary, and their eyes seemed to be scanning the room in a predatory manner. The leader of the group appeared to be a tall, muscular recruit with close-cropped blonde hair and a cocky smile that never seemed to leave his face. His name tag read Morrison. Sarah had encountered his type before, young men who came into military service thinking their physical strength and loud personality would automatically earn them respect and authority. They usually learned better through proper training and discipline, but occasionally some slipped through the cracks. Sarah found an empty table about 15 feet away from the group, positioning herself where she could observe them without being obvious about it. She opened a notebook and pretended to review some paperwork, though she was actually documenting her observations for her report. The facility's training protocols were under review, and any behavioral issues among recruits were exactly what she was here to identify. Morrison's voice carried across the mess hall as he regaled his companions with what sounded like an exaggerated story about his weekend leave. His friends laughed at all the right moments, clearly seeing him as their informal leader. Sarah noticed how other recruits at nearby tables seemed to give the group a wide berth, suggesting this wasn't the first time their behavior had made others uncomfortable. As Sarah continued her observation, a young female recruit entered the mess hall alone. She looked nervous and uncertain, probably one of the newer arrivals to the facility. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, and she moved with the careful precision of someone still learning military bearing. Sarah recognized the signs of a recruit trying hard to fit in and prove herself worthy of being there. The female recruit went through the food line and looked around for a place to sit. Most tables were either full or occupied by established groups that didn't seem welcoming to newcomers. Sarah considered inviting her over, but decided that maintaining her cover was more important for the investigation she was conducting. Unfortunately, Morrison had also noticed the new arrival. Sarah watched as he said something to his companions that made them all turn to look at the young woman. Their expressions shifted to something that made Sarah's instincts immediately go on alert. She had seen that look before in combat zones and dangerous situations. It was the look of predators who had spotted isolated prey. The female recruit finally chose an empty table near the center of the mess hall, clearly hoping to blend in with the general population. She sat down and began eating quietly, occasionally glancing around the room with the wariness of someone who sensed she was being watched but couldn't identify the source of her unease. Morrison stood up from his table and said something to his friends that Sarah couldn't quite hear over the general noise of the mess hall. Whatever he said made them all laugh and nod in agreement. Sarah felt her muscles tense as she watched the 5 young men exchange meaningful looks and begin to move in a coordinated fashion. What happened next unfolded like a carefully planned military operation, except this one was designed to intimidate and isolate rather than accomplish any legitimate objective. Morrison approached the female recruit's table from the front, while 2 of his companions moved to flank her from either side. The other 2 positioned themselves behind her, effectively blocking her escape routes. Sarah's training kicked in automatically as she assessed the tactical situation developing before her eyes. The 5 recruits had unconsciously arranged themselves in a pattern that would be familiar to any military strategist. They had created a controlled environment where their target had limited options for movement or escape. Whether they realized it or not, they were employing basic principles of battlefield control in a social setting. The female recruit looked up as Morrison approached her table, and Sarah could see the confusion and growing alarm in her posture. The young woman clearly sensed that something was wrong, but her lack of experience in dealing with such situations left her uncertain about how to respond. She was trapped not just physically by the positioning of the 5 men, but psychologically by her desire to not cause trouble or appear unable to handle herself. Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of everyone's day. She closed her notebook and stood up, her movement still casual but with a subtle shift in body language that anyone with combat experience would recognize. She was no longer just an observer. She was preparing to engage. As she began walking toward the confrontation that was about to unfold, Sarah reflected on how many times she had been in similar situations during her military career. The difference was that those encounters had usually involved enemy combatants in foreign countries, not American recruits in a domestic training facility. The principle remained the same, though. Someone who couldn't defend themselves was about to be victimized by people who should have known better. The mess hall continued its normal operations around them, most people oblivious to the drama that was beginning to play out. Sarah moved through the other diners like a shark through water, her approach angle calculated to give her the maximum tactical advantage once she reached the confrontation zone. Morrison had reached the female recruit's table and was leaning down toward her, his voice low enough that his words wouldn't carry to other tables, but loud enough for his companions to hear and appreciate his performance. The young woman had stopped eating and was looking around desperately for help that didn't seem to be coming. Sarah was still 20 feet away when Morrison made his first major mistake of the day. Morrison leaned closer to the female recruit, his voice taking on a tone that was unmistakably threatening, despite being quiet enough to avoid attracting attention from the mess hall staff. Well, what do we have here? A little lost lamb, all by herself? His companions chuckled appreciatively at what they clearly considered witty banter, but their positioning around the table made their intentions obvious to anyone who understood tactical movement. The young woman tried to maintain her composure, but Sarah could see her hands trembling slightly as she set down her fork. "I'm just trying to eat my lunch," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her posture. Sarah felt a surge of respect for the recruit's attempt to de-escalate the situation through calm communication. "Oh, you're trying to eat?" Morrison's voice carried mock concern that fooled absolutely no one. "That's funny because we were just talking about how some people don't really belong in places like this. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else? Somewhere more suitable for someone like you?" The implied threat was clear to everyone in the immediate area, though Morrison was careful to avoid saying anything that could be directly reported as harassment. Sarah recognized the technique. It was psychological, warfare designed to make the target feel isolated and unwelcome without providing clear evidence of wrongdoing. Unfortunately for Morrison and his friends, they had chosen to demonstrate this technique in front of someone who had extensive experience in actual warfare. Sarah continued her approach, her movements still appearing casual to any observer who didn't know what to look for. She had spent years perfecting the ability to move through hostile territory without alerting enemies to her presence, and those skills served her well in civilian settings too. Her route would bring her to the female recruit's table from an angle that would put her between the young woman and Morrison's 2 companions who were positioned on her left side. The female recruit made another attempt to end the confrontation peacefully. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I'll finish eating and leave if that's what you want." Her willingness to give ground might have been strategically sound in some situations, but Sarah could see that Morrison interpreted it as weakness rather than wisdom. "That's more like it," Morrison said with satisfaction, clearly pleased that his intimidation tactics were working. "See, boys? Sometimes people just need a little encouragement to understand where they fit in." His companions nodded and made various sounds of agreement, apparently proud of their leader's success in terrorizing someone half their size. What none of them realized was that their victim's apparent surrender had been observed by someone who had built her entire career on protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Sarah had faced down enemy combatants in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and she had exactly zero tolerance for bullies who preyed on the vulnerable. Sarah reached the optimal position for her intervention and made a slight adjustment to her approach angle. Military tacticians would have recognized her movement as a classic flanking maneuver, designed to neutralize multiple threats while maintaining maximum options for escalation or de-escalation, based on how the situation developed. Morrison was so focused on savoring his apparent victory that he failed to notice Sarah's approach until she was within arm's reach of his position. When he finally became aware of her presence, his first reaction was annoyance at the interruption, rather than concern about potential consequences. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from years of command experience. "I couldn't help but notice that you seem to be having some kind of problem here." Morrison straightened up and turned to face this unexpected interloper, his expression shifting from smugness to irritation. "This doesn't concern you, lady. We're just having a friendly conversation with our fellow recruit here." His tone suggested that Sarah should mind her own business and move along before she found herself in more trouble than she could handle. Sarah smiled pleasantly, the kind of smile that experienced warriors recognize as being far more dangerous than any scowl or grimace. "I'm sure you are, but I'm wondering if maybe there's been some kind of misunderstanding about what constitutes a friendly conversation." The female recruit looked up at Sarah with a mixture of hope and terror, clearly afraid that this intervention might make her situation worse rather than better. She had probably been taught that the best way to handle military harassment was to endure it quietly and report it through proper channels later, assuming anyone would believe her word against 5 male recruits. Morrison's companions had also taken notice of Sarah's presence, and she could see them exchanging glances as they tried to figure out who she was and whether she represented any kind of threat to their activities. Their body language suggested they were used to civilian women being intimidated by their group presence and military bearing. "Look, this really isn't any of your business," said one of Morrison's friends, a shorter recruit with dark hair and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was more follower than leader. "We're all military here, and we handle our own problems our own way." Sarah nodded thoughtfully as if considering this perspective seriously. "That's an interesting point. Military personnel definitely should handle their own problems their own way." She paused for just long enough to let that statement settle before continuing. "The question is, what happens when military personnel forget what their own way is supposed to be?" Morrison was clearly growing impatient with this philosophical discussion. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you need to walk away right now before this gets unpleasant for you." His voice had taken on the kind of edge that suggested he was prepared to escalate beyond verbal intimidation if necessary. Sarah's expression remained pleasantly neutral, but anyone with combat experience would have noticed the subtle shift in her stance that indicated she was preparing for potential physical confrontation. "You know, you're absolutely right that I should probably walk away. But I have this character flaw where I have trouble walking away when I see people being treated unfairly." The female recruit had stopped eating entirely and was watching this exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a traffic accident in slow motion. She clearly wanted to escape the situation. But Morrison's positioning still blocked her most direct route to the exit, and his companions maintained their strategic positions around the table. Morrison took a step closer to Sarah, obviously intending to use his size and physical presence to intimidate her into backing down. He was several inches taller than she was and probably outweighed her by 50 pounds of muscle, advantages that had likely served him well in previous confrontations with people who weren't trained to neutralize such disparities. "Character flaw?" Morrison repeated with a laugh that his friends dutifully echoed. "Well, maybe someone needs to help you work on that character flaw. We wouldn't want you getting into situations you can't handle." Sarah looked around at the 5 recruits surrounding her and the female recruit, taking her time to make eye contact with each of them. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, still polite and conversational, but with an undertone that suggested she was no longer playing games. "You know what? You're absolutely right. Someone definitely should help with character flaws around here." She paused and looked directly at Morrison. "The question is, whose character needs the most work?" Morrison's face darkened at what he clearly interpreted as a challenge to his authority and dominance. His military training should have taught him to recognize when he was facing someone with superior tactical awareness, but his ego had apparently overridden his common sense. "Listen here, sweetheart," he said, his voice dropping to a more menacing tone. "You've got about 10 seconds to walk away before we decide you're as much of a problem as she is." The casual use of sweetheart was exactly the kind of mistake that Sarah had been waiting for. It demonstrated not only disrespect for her as an individual, but a fundamental misunderstanding of military values and proper conduct. More importantly, from a tactical perspective, it showed that Morrison was allowing emotion and prejudice to cloud his judgment about the threat assessment he should have been conducting. Sarah glanced around the mess hall, noting that their confrontation was beginning to attract attention from other diners. A few recruits at nearby tables had stopped eating and were watching the drama unfold with the fascination that people always showed when witnessing potential conflict. More importantly, she spotted 2 drill instructors near the serving line who had also taken notice of the situation, but hadn't yet decided whether intervention was necessary. 10 seconds? Sarah repeated thoughtfully, as if seriously considering Morrison's ultimatum. That's very specific. I appreciate a man who sets clear deadlines. Her tone remained conversational, but she shifted her weight slightly, a movement so subtle that only someone with extensive combat training would recognize it as preparation for explosive action. The female recruit had pushed her chair back slightly from the table, clearly hoping to create some space between herself and whatever was about to happen. Her instincts were good, even if her experience was limited. Sarah made a mental note to suggest that the young woman might have potential for advanced tactical training if she survived her current predicament. Morrison's companions were growing more aggressive in their posturing, apparently interpreting their leader's escalation as permission to become more openly threatening. The 2 recruits positioned behind the female recruit moved closer, while the ones flanking Sarah adjusted their positions to what they obviously thought was a more advantageous formation. What none of them realized was that their movements were being observed and analyzed by someone who had spent years studying how to neutralize multiple opponents in confined spaces. Sarah's mind automatically calculated angles of attack, potential weapons of opportunity, and escape routes not just for herself, but for the civilian she was protecting. The tactical situation was actually much more favorable than many she had faced in actual combat zones. "Time's up, lady," Morrison announced with satisfaction, clearly pleased with his own sense of dramatic timing. "Last chance to walk away with your dignity intact." Sarah looked at him with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "You know, that's an interesting phrase, a dignity intact. Can you help me understand exactly what you think dignity means in this context?" Her question seemed to catch Morrison off guard, as if he hadn't expected a philosophical discussion in the middle of his intimidation routine. The drill instructors near the serving line had definitely taken notice now and were moving in their direction, though they were still far enough away that whatever happened next would be over before they could intervene. Sarah was aware of their approach but didn't allow it to influence her tactical planning. She had been in too many situations where backup was promised, but didn't arrive in time to rely on external assistance. Morrison's confusion at Sarah's question quickly transformed back into anger. "Stop playing games with me," he snarled, taking another step forward that brought him well within what any security expert would consider her personal threat zone. "You think you're clever with your smart mouth, but you're about to learn what happens to people who don't know their place." The phrase "know their place" was another tactical error that provided Sarah with valuable intelligence about Morrison's mindset and motivations. This wasn't just about intimidating one female recruit. It was about establishing a hierarchy based on his assumptions about gender, authority, and power. Unfortunately for Morrison, his assumptions were about to be challenged by someone who had built her career on overturning exactly those kinds of preconceptions. Sarah nodded slowly, as if finally understanding something important. "Ah, I see. This is about knowing our place. That actually clarifies things quite a bit." She looked around at the 5 recruits surrounding her and smiled. "So tell me, what exactly do you think my place is in this situation?" The question seemed to embolden Morrison, who clearly interpreted it as submission or at least recognition of his superior position. Your place is to mind your own business and let us handle military matters the way they're supposed to be handled." His chest puffed out slightly as he delivered what he obviously considered a definitive statement of authority. "Military matters," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "That's fascinating. And what's your understanding of how military matters are supposed to be handled? Because I have to admit, your approach doesn't match what I learned during my own military training." This casual reference to her own military background caused a ripple of uncertainty through Morrison's group. They exchanged glances, clearly trying to figure out whether Sarah was bluffing or whether they had missed some important information about who they were dealing with. Their formation remained intact, but Sarah could see doubt creeping into their body language. Morrison, however, was too committed to his course of action to back down now. "I don't care what you think you learned, lady. This is how things work in the real military, not whatever fantasy version you might have in your head." His dismissive tone suggested he assumed any military experience she might have had was probably in some non-combat support role that didn't qualify her to understand real military culture. Sarah's smile widened slightly, taking on a quality that made the female recruit look suddenly hopeful, and Morrison's companions look suddenly nervous. "The real military," she said softly. "Yes, I can see how that would be important to establish. Tell me, what's the longest deployment you've been on?" The question caught Morrison completely off guard. He had obviously expected either submission or emotional outrage, not a calm inquiry about his military experience. That's not relevant," he stammered, clearly uncomfortable with having his credentials questioned in front of his followers. "Oh, but I think it is relevant," Sarah continued in the same conversational tone. "See, in my experience, people who talk about the real military usually have very specific ideas about what that means. And those ideas are usually based on their own experiences. So I'm curious about what experiences have shaped your understanding." The drill instructors were getting closer, but they seemed to be slowing their approach as they realized this confrontation wasn't developing the way they had initially expected. Instead of escalating into immediate violence, it had become a verbal sparring match where one participant was systematically dismantling the other's credibility. Morrison's face was getting redder by the moment, and Sarah could see his hands clenching into fists. His friends were looking increasingly uncomfortable as they realized their leader was not performing as well as expected in this exchange. The tactical situation was shifting in Sarah's favor without any physical action being required. "You know what?" Morrison said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I'm done talking. Maybe you'll understand better when you're picking yourself up off the floor." Morrison drew back his right hand in what was clearly preparation for a punch aimed at Sarah's face. It was a telegraphed movement that any first-year martial arts student would have seen coming from a mile away. But Morrison apparently expected his size and aggression to overwhelm any defensive capabilities his target might possess. His technique showed all the hallmarks of someone who had relied on intimidation rather than skill in previous confrontations. Sarah's response was so fast and fluid that most observers would later have difficulty describing exactly what they had witnessed. As Morrison's punch began its trajectory toward her face, Sarah stepped slightly to her left while simultaneously grabbing his extended wrist with her right hand and placing her left hand against his elbow. The leverage and momentum she generated sent Morrison spinning in a direction he had definitely not intended to go. The throw that followed was textbook perfect, a technique that Sarah had practiced thousands of times during her military training and used effectively in actual combat situations. Morrison found himself airborne for what felt like much longer than the laws of physics should have allowed, before landing hard on his back on the mess hall floor with a sound that could be heard throughout the room. The entire sequence from Morrison's initial punch to his impact with the floor took less than 3 seconds, but it changed the tactical situation so dramatically that his 4 companions seemed frozen in disbelief. They had gone from being part of a coordinated intimidation effort to watching their leader get systematically dismantled by someone they had assumed was just another civilian woman. Sarah straightened up and brushed an imaginary speck of dust from her sweater, her expression as calm and pleasant as it had been throughout the entire confrontation. "You know," she said conversationally to Morrison, who was lying on the floor making gasping sounds as he tried to get his breath back, "I think there might have been some miscommunication about who knows their place here." The mess hall had gone completely quiet except for the sound of Morrison trying to breathe, and the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Every person in the room was staring at their table, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The female recruit was looking at Sarah with an expression of pure amazement, as if she had just watched a superhero materialize out of thin air. Morrison's companions were faced with a decision that their limited tactical training hadn't prepared them for. Their leader was down, their intimidation strategy had backfired spectacularly, and they were now confronting someone who had just demonstrated capabilities far beyond what they had anticipated. The smart move would have been to help Morrison up, apologize profusely, and retreat as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, the combination of embarrassment, peer pressure, and poor judgment led them to make a much worse decision. The two recruits who had been flanking Sarah moved simultaneously, apparently deciding that a coordinated attack by multiple opponents would succeed, where Morrison's solo effort had failed so dramatically. Sarah had been expecting this development and was ready for it. Her years of combat experience had taught her that bullies rarely traveled alone and almost never accepted defeat gracefully. As the two recruits moved toward her from different angles, she was already calculating the timing and positioning needed to neutralize both threats without causing more damage than absolutely necessary. The recruit coming from her left was slightly faster than his companion, reaching her first with what appeared to be an attempt at a tackle designed to knock her to the ground. Sarah sidestepped his charge while grabbing his outstretched arm and using his own momentum to send him crashing into the empty table behind her. The collision between recruit and furniture created a tremendous clatter that added to the dramatic atmosphere of the confrontation. The second attacker had the advantage of seeing his companion's fate and attempted to adjust his approach accordingly. Instead of rushing straight at Sarah, he tried to circle around to her blind spot while she was dealing with his friend. It was actually a reasonably intelligent tactical modification, but it was being executed by someone with limited training against someone with extensive experience in multiple opponent scenarios. Sarah tracked his movement with peripheral vision while appearing to focus on helping the first attacker untangle himself from the overturned table. At the moment when the circling recruit committed to his attack, she spun around and delivered a perfectly timed palm strike to his solar plexus that stopped his forward momentum immediately and sent him stumbling backward into one of his remaining companions. The domino effect that followed was almost comical in its inevitability. The stumbling recruit collided with his friend, who was trying to decide whether to join the attack or retreat, sending both of them staggering backward into Morrison, who had just managed to get to his hands and knees. All three recruits ended up in a tangled heap on the floor, looking like participants in a particularly unsuccessful comedy routine. The fifth and final member of Morrison's group had been watching this systematic dismantling of his companions with growing horror and was apparently intelligent enough to recognize that continuing the confrontation would only result in his own humiliation. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender and took several steps backward, clearly hoping to distance himself from the tactical disaster that was unfolding around him. Sarah looked around at the scattered recruits with the expression of someone who had just finished a mildly interesting training exercise. "Well," she said pleasantly, "I think we've established some important points about military protocol and proper conduct." Her breathing was completely normal, and there wasn't a wrinkle in her clothing despite having just neutralized 5 attackers in less than 30 seconds. The drill instructors had finally reached the scene of the confrontation, though they arrived to find the situation already resolved. Their expression suggested they were having difficulty processing what they were seeing. 5 male recruits in various states of defeat on the mess hall floor, 1 female recruit sitting safely at her table, and 1 woman in civilian clothes standing calmly in the middle of it all, looking like she had just finished ordering coffee. Morrison had managed to get back to his feet, though he was still moving gingerly and his face showed a mixture of pain, embarrassment, and dawning realization that he had made a serious error in judgment. His companions were also picking themselves up from the floor, their earlier confidence replaced by the kind of nervous energy that comes from having one's worldview suddenly and dramatically readjusted. The senior drill instructor, a grizzled veteran with the weathered face of someone who had seen everything the military had to offer, approached Sarah with a mixture of suspicion and growing respect. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm going to need to ask you to identify yourself and explain what happened here." Sarah reached into her back pocket and withdrew her military identification, holding it out for the drill instructor to examine. As he read the information on the card, his expression shifted from suspicion to surprise to something approaching awe. "Lieutenant Chen," he said slowly, his voice taking on the tone of someone who had just realized he was in the presence of military royalty. "I believe we need to have a conversation." Senior drill instructor Martinez stared at Sarah's identification for several long seconds, his weathered features showing the kind of respect that came from recognizing genuine military achievement. The card identified her as Lieutenant Sarah Chen, United States Navy, with security clearances and unit designations that made it clear she was far from an ordinary service member. "Navy SEAL," Martinez said quietly. Though his voice carried clearly in the suddenly silent mess hall, the words fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock and understanding that spread throughout the room. Every recruit present knew what those words meant, even if they had never met an actual SEAL before. Morrison's face went through a series of expressions as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his consciousness. He had just attempted to assault a Navy SEAL in front of dozens of witnesses, including multiple drill instructors. His military career, which had seemed so promising just minutes earlier, was suddenly looking very uncertain. Sarah accepted her identification back from Martinez and tucked it into her pocket. "Drill Instructor Martinez," she said, reading his name tag. "I was conducting an unofficial observation for my commanding officer when this situation developed. I apologize for not identifying myself earlier, but I thought it was important to see how it would play out naturally." Martinez nodded slowly, his tactical mind already working through the implications of what had just occurred. "Lieutenant, with respect, these recruits had no way of knowing your identity or background. From their perspective, they were dealing with a civilian interference situation." Sarah appreciated the drill instructor's diplomatic approach, but she wasn't about to let Morrison and his companions off the hook that easily. "That's an interesting point, drill instructor. But I'm curious about your assessment of their initial behavior toward the female recruit. Was that consistent with proper military conduct and values?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Martinez found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to evaluate his own recruit's behavior in front of a superior officer who had witnessed everything firsthand. He looked around at the mess hall, taking in the overturned furniture, the scattered recruits, and the young woman who was still sitting at her table looking stunned by the entire experience. "No, ma'am," Martinez admitted after a moment. "Their behavior was completely inappropriate and violated multiple regulations regarding conduct toward fellow service members." His voice carried the disappointment of a professional who had just seen his trainees fail a crucial test of character. Morrison tried to speak up, apparently hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of his situation. "Drill instructor, you were just what, Recruit Morrison?" Martinez's voice cracked like a whip, cutting off whatever excuse Morrison had been preparing to offer. "You were just demonstrating the kind of leadership and military bearing that you think the Navy wants to see from its future sailors." The public dressing down was clearly devastating for Morrison, who had apparently built his identity around being seen as a natural leader and superior physical specimen. To have his behavior criticized so harshly in front of his peers and a genuine military hero was clearly more than his ego could handle. Sarah watched the exchange with professional interest, noting how quickly the power dynamic had shifted once the truth about her identity became known. It was a lesson she had seen played out countless times in her military career. Respect based on actual achievement and competence versus respect based on intimidation and bluster were two entirely different things. The female recruit who had been the original target of harassment finally found her voice. "Ma'am," she said quietly to Sarah, "thank you for helping me. I didn't know what to do, and I was really scared." Her honesty and vulnerability in that moment showed more genuine courage than anything Morrison and his friends had displayed during the entire confrontation. Sarah turned to face the young woman, her expression softening with genuine warmth. "What's your name, recruit?" she asked kindly. "Recruit Johnson, ma'am. Maria Johnson. I've been here for 3 weeks. Johnson's voice was steadier now, though she still looked shaken by everything that had happened. Her uniform was still perfectly pressed despite the stress she had endured, showing the kind of attention to detail that suggested she had potential for military excellence. "Recruit Johnson," Sarah said formally. You conducted yourself with dignity and restraint in a difficult situation. That shows good judgment and self-control, which are important military virtues. The praise was clearly meaningful to Johnson, who straightened her shoulders with visible pride. Martinez had been listening to this exchange while keeping one eye on Morrison and his companions, who were still dealing with the physical and emotional aftermath of their defeat. Lieutenant Chen, he said, what would you recommend as appropriate action regarding these recruits? Sarah considered the question carefully. As a Navy SEAL, she understood the importance of discipline and accountability in military organizations. At the same time, she knew that young people could learn from their mistakes if given the opportunity to do so properly. The challenge was finding a response that would be educational rather than purely punitive. Drill Instructor Martinez, she said formally, I believe this situation provides an excellent learning opportunity for everyone involved. These recruits have demonstrated some significant gaps in their understanding of military values and proper conduct. Perhaps they would benefit from some additional training in those areas. Martinez's expression suggested he understood exactly what Sarah was implying with her diplomatic language. Yes, ma'am. I believe some remedial training in military ethics and proper conduct would be very appropriate, along with physical training to help them understand the importance of discipline and self-control. Morrison and his companions clearly realized that their immediate future was going to involve considerable unpleasantness, but they were in no position to object to whatever punishment was deemed appropriate. They had been caught red-handed engaging in behavior that violated multiple military regulations, and their victim had turned out to be someone whose word would carry significant weight in any formal investigation. Sarah looked around the mess hall, noting that the drama had attracted the attention of virtually every person in the room. I think this situation also provides a good opportunity to discuss what military service really means, she said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. It's not about physical intimidation or establishing dominance over people who are different from you. She paused, making eye contact with recruits throughout the mess hall. Military service is about protecting people who can't protect themselves, supporting your fellow service members, and upholding the values that make our country worth defending. Those values include treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their gender, background, or experience level. The impromptu speech was clearly having an impact on the young recruits who were listening. The silence in the mess hall was profound as Sarah's words settled over the assembled recruits. Many of them were clearly processing what they had witnessed and heard, recognizing that they had just received a masterclass in both military values and tactical skills from someone who embodied the highest levels of both. Sarah continued her address, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about military service through years of actual combat experience. Some of you might be wondering how someone my size could handle 5 larger opponents so easily. The answer isn't about physical strength or aggression. It's about training, discipline, and understanding that true power comes from protecting others, not intimidating them. Morrison was still standing awkwardly near the overturned table, his face a mixture of shame and confusion. The reality of his situation was clearly sinking in. He had not only failed spectacularly in his attempt to intimidate 2 women, but he had done so in front of dozens of witnesses and multiple authority figures. His reputation among his peers was effectively destroyed, and his military career was hanging by a thread. Drill Instructor Martinez stepped forward, clearly eager to restore some semblance of order to his training environment. Recruits Morrison, Stevens, Rodriguez, Patterson, and Williams, he barked, addressing Morrison's group by name. You will report to my office immediately after this meal period. We have some serious discussions ahead of us about your futures in the United States Navy. The 5 recruits nodded miserably, clearly understanding that those serious discussions were likely to determine whether they would be allowed to continue their military service or would be discharged for conduct violations. Their dreams of military careers were suddenly in serious jeopardy because of a few minutes of poor judgment and worse behavior. Sarah turned her attention back to Recruit Johnson, who was still sitting at her table but now looked considerably more confident than she had when the confrontation began. Recruit Johnson, I'd like to ask you a question. What do you think the most important lesson is from what just happened here? Johnson considered the question carefully before responding. Ma'am, I think the lesson is that how we treat other people says more about our character than how strong we are or how intimidating we can be, and that standing up for what's right is more important than avoiding conflict. Sarah smiled at the thoughtful response. That's an excellent answer, Recruit Johnson. You clearly understand something that some people take years to learn, if they ever learn it at all. She paused and looked around the mess hall again. I'd also add that true strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Martinez had been observing this interaction with growing respect for both Sarah's handling of the situation and Johnson's mature response to it. Lieutenant Chen, he said, would you be willing to speak with our training staff about incorporating some of these lessons into our regular curriculum? I think your perspective would be valuable for all our recruits. Sarah considered the request seriously. Her original mission had been simply to observe training protocols and recruit behavior, but the events of the past hour had revealed some significant issues that needed to be addressed systematically rather than just in response to individual incidents. I think that would be very beneficial, Drill Instructor Martinez, she replied. Military training should include not just physical and tactical skills, but also the ethical foundation that makes those skills worthwhile. Perhaps we could develop some scenarios that help recruits understand the difference between strength and bullying. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the base commander, a stern-faced colonel who had clearly been summoned by someone who realized that a significant incident had occurred in the mess hall. His expression as he surveyed the scene, overturned furniture, dejected recruits, and a mysterious civilian woman commanding everyone's respectful attention, suggested he was preparing for a very complicated briefing. Drill Instructor Martinez, the colonel said formally, I understand we've had some kind of incident here. Can you bring me up to speed on what happened? Martinez straightened to attention and began providing a concise but thorough summary of the events, starting with Morrison's harassment of Johnson and continuing through Sarah's intervention and the subsequent revelation of her identity. As the story unfolded, the colonel's expression shifted from concern to surprise to something approaching disbelief. When Martinez finished his report, the colonel turned to Sarah with obvious curiosity. Lieutenant Chen, I presume? I have to say your reputation precedes you, though I wasn't expecting to meet you under these circumstances. His tone was respectful but clearly indicated he wanted a more detailed explanation of how a Navy SEAL had ended up in his mess hall dealing with recruit discipline issues. Sarah provided a brief explanation of her observation mission, being careful to emphasize that she had been acting in an unofficial capacity when the harassment situation developed. She also made it clear that she had tried to de-escalate the situation verbally before resorting to physical intervention. The colonel listened carefully, occasionally nodding as Sarah described the sequence of events. When she finished, he was quiet for several moments, clearly thinking through the implications and appropriate responses. Lieutenant, he said finally, I want to thank you for protecting Recruit Johnson and for handling this situation with such professionalism. However, I'm also concerned about some of the systemic issues this incident has revealed. Sarah appreciated the colonel's recognition that the problem went beyond just 5 poorly behaved recruits. Sir, I share those concerns. This kind of behavior suggests there may be gaps in our training protocols that allow some recruits to develop attitudes and practices that are incompatible with military values. The colonel nodded grimly. Agreed. Martinez, I want a full review of our harassment prevention training and our protocols for addressing inappropriate behavior among recruits. This kind of incident should never have gotten as far as it did. His voice carried the weight of command, authority, and clear disappointment in the failure of existing systems. Morrison and his companions had been standing silently throughout this high-level discussion of their behavior, clearly understanding that their futures were being decided by people whose judgment would carry significant weight. The reality that their actions had attracted the attention of the base commander was obviously adding to their already considerable anxiety about potential consequences. Recruit Johnson had been listening to the conversation with fascination, clearly amazed that her ordeal had resulted in such high-level attention to issues of harassment and military conduct. Sir, she said quietly to the colonel, may I say something? The colonel looked at her with surprise but nodded encouragingly. Of course, Recruit Johnson. What would you like to add? Johnson stood up and came to attention before speaking. Sir, I just want to say that Lieutenant Chen showed me what it really means to be a warrior. Not because she could fight, but because she was willing to stand up for someone who needed help. That's the kind of sailor I want to become. Her words hung in the air with simple eloquence, capturing something essential about military service that all the training manuals and regulations sometimes failed to convey. The colonel's expression softened slightly as he recognized the genuine inspiration in the young recruit's voice. 6 months later, the Naval Training Facility had implemented sweeping changes to its recruit training programs. The incident in the mess hall had become a catalyst for examining not just harassment prevention protocols, but the entire approach to developing military character and values among new service members. Sarah stood before a classroom of new recruits, delivering what had become known as the mess hall lecture, a regular part of the curriculum that used the events of that day as a foundation for discussing military ethics, proper conduct, and the true meaning of strength in military service. The room was packed, with standing room only as word had spread about the Navy SEAL who had revolutionized their training approach. "The question I want you to consider today," Sarah said to the attentive audience, "is not whether you're strong enough to intimidate someone weaker than you. Anyone can do that. The question is whether you're strong enough to protect someone who needs protection, even when it's difficult or dangerous or unpopular." In the front row sat Recruit Johnson, now several months into her training and showing remarkable progress in both physical conditioning and leadership development. She had become something of a minor celebrity among the recruits, not because of what had happened to her, but because of how she had handled the aftermath with dignity and determination to excel. Near the back of the room, Morrison sat with a small group of recruits who were participating in a special remedial program designed for service members who had demonstrated behavioral issues during their initial training. After extensive counseling and additional education about military values, he had been given a second chance to prove he belonged in military service. The program had been controversial among some staff members who felt that his actions should have resulted in immediate discharge. But Sarah had advocated for the rehabilitation approach. "People can change if they're given the right tools and motivation," she had argued. "Our job is to build sailors, not just eliminate the ones who don't start out perfect." Morrison's transformation had been gradual but genuine. The humiliation of being defeated so decisively by someone he had underestimated had initially filled him with resentment and anger. However, the combination of counseling, additional training, and exposure to actual military values had slowly helped him understand where his thinking had gone wrong. During one particularly difficult counseling session, Morrison had finally admitted that his behavior in the mess hall had been driven by insecurity and fear rather than confidence and strength. "I thought being tough meant making other people afraid of me," he had confessed. "I didn't understand that real toughness means being willing to do the right thing even when it's hard." Sarah continued her presentation, using specific examples from her own military experience to illustrate points about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. She spoke about missions where success had depended not on individual heroics, but on team members supporting each other and ensuring that no one was left behind. "In actual combat," she explained, "the people who survive and succeed are not the ones who try to dominate their teammates. They're the ones who understand that everyone's safety depends on everyone else doing their job properly. Harassment, intimidation, and bullying don't just hurt the immediate victims. They undermine the trust and cooperation that military units need to function effectively." After the formal presentation, Sarah opened the floor for questions. A young female recruit raised her hand tentatively. "Ma'am, what should we do if we witness harassment or inappropriate behavior? I mean, most of us aren't Navy SEALs who can handle 5 guys at once." Sarah smiled at the question, which got to the heart of one of the most important lessons from the mess hall incident. "The physical confrontation was actually the least important part of what happened that day," she explained. "The most important part was the decision to get involved when someone needed help. You don't need special combat training to speak up, to report inappropriate behavior, or to offer support to someone who's being targeted." She paused and looked around the room. The reason that situation escalated to physical confrontation was because too many people had chosen to look the other way when they saw inappropriate behavior. If someone had addressed Morrison's attitude and actions earlier, before they became entrenched patterns, the whole incident might have been prevented. Recruit Johnson raised her hand and was recognized to speak. Ma'am, I want to thank you again for what you did that day, but I also want to ask about something else. Since then, I've seen other recruits who were struggling or being picked on, and I've tried to help them the way you helped me. Is that the right approach? Sarah's expression showed genuine pride in Johnson's development. That's exactly the right approach, Recruit Johnson. Military service is about building a community where everyone has the opportunity to succeed and contribute. When you help someone else succeed, you're strengthening the entire organization. Near the end of the session, Morrison surprised everyone by raising his hand to ask a question. The room grew quiet as people recognized him. His story had become well known throughout the training facility as an example of both the consequences of poor judgment and the possibility of redemption through genuine change. "Ma'am," Morrison said, his voice showing none of the arrogance that had characterized his earlier interactions. "I wanted to ask about forgiveness and second chances. I know what I did was wrong, and I've been working to change. But sometimes I wonder if people will ever see me as anything other than the guy who harassed a fellow recruit." Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "That's a thoughtful question, Morrison, and it gets to something important about personal growth and accountability. The reality is that some people may always remember your mistakes, and that's a consequence you have to accept. But what matters more is whether you continue to demonstrate through your actions that you've learned from those mistakes." She looked directly at him as she continued. "The person you were 6 months ago made some poor choices that hurt other people and violated military values. The person you're becoming has the opportunity to make better choices every day. Focus on being that better person consistently, and eventually your current actions will speak louder than your past mistakes." Morrison nodded, clearly taking the words to heart. "Thank you, ma'am. I won't let you down, or let the Navy down." As the session concluded, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that dramatic day in the mess hall. The incident had revealed serious problems in the training environment, but it had also created opportunities for improvement that might never have existed otherwise. Johnson approached her after the other recruits had left. "Lieutenant Chen, I wanted you to know that I've decided to apply for advanced tactical training after I complete basic training. What happened that day showed me that I want to be someone who can protect others the way you protected me." Sarah smiled and shook the young woman's hand. "I think you'd be excellent at it, Johnson. You already understand the most important part, that real strength comes from helping others, not hurting them." As Sarah left the training facility that day, she reflected on the lasting impact of a few minutes of poor judgment and the intervention that followed. 5 recruits had learned hard lessons about consequences and character. 1 recruit had discovered her own strength and potential. An entire training program had been reformed to better reflect military values, and countless future sailors would benefit from improved policies and protocols designed to prevent harassment and promote mutual respect. The mess hall incident had become a teaching moment that would influence military training for years to come, proving that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in everyday moments when people choose between doing what's easy and doing what's right.